So I love this question because it's one I've wanted to be asked by my mother and my children, and they don't. But this is a question from Lewis, who says, I'd be fascinated to see how a piece is fact-checked, written and published so that the public can see the true value of the mainstream media and what it does. Could you do this?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? And we're not often given the chance to explain our processes. And on the Features Desk, Melissa, you work across a wide range of subjects, and sometimes these turn into sort of months-long investigations. Can you take us through the process? So first of all, commissioning a piece, and then the whole process of editing and fact-checking and, going back to subjects in the piece, getting those responses, legaling, all of that.
Yeah, so I thought it would be useful to, every piece is so different, to talk about two sort of features I've worked on, one with Anoosh, which I'll come to second. The first one was one we ran probably 18 months ago, which was Stuart McGurk on A Year Inside GB News. And Stuart is the former features editor at GQ magazine. We'd never worked before. He had just started freelancing, and we met for a coffee and talked about a few ideas. And this was the one that we both liked the most, which was, I think at that point it was only 8 to 9 months into GB News's life. And it was chaotic. And I think Andrew Neil had gone. People were leaving. But a lot of the things that made it into the final version of the piece, we didn't yet know. We didn't know that Talk TV was going to launch. We didn't know quite how chaotic things were going to get. We didn't realise the sort of culture wars that would erupt both within and with outside the station. So I think that was towards the end of 2021. We got the green light. So I will say yes, then I will go to the editor-in-chief, because these things, especially if it's a freelancer, take time and money. So, they do need sign off and investment, and to be sure that it's something that works for everybody. And then Stuart went off and started talking to people, and that was a 4-month process. Mm-hmm. And, the story sort of gathered steam. And I think that the difficult and the positive thing was there were a lot of people who wanted to talk to him, a lot of people who were unhappy, almost nobody on the record. And that's very challenging, because they were either still working there or they had signed non-disclosure agreements. So there was a lot of us trying to get a few more people on the record, because as journalists, you always want to. But I think we had such a critical volume of voices and stories and great stories and corroborating stories that ultimately was enough. And yes, we did. We had, I remember putting together my email for GB News, sort of probably just about a couple of weeks before we published, because you wait till you've got the final version really to think, I don't want to put lots of things to them throughout the process. It's got to be done at the end. And it was 1 page of fact checks, which were embarrassing things like, is it true you launched with only 3 mics and 8 presenters? Is it true that this presenter stood up and screamed at the whole newsroom because someone had drunk her squash? To some more serious allegations, which were which we didn't expect to find, but about quite a toxic work environment. So there was sort of a part 1 and a part 2 to that. They were aware we were doing the piece. We did interview the CEO. We went to the studio, and so we had that side of it. We did have their side of the story. Yeah. But yeah, then you get your responses back from GB News, and those in themselves, it's actually about a part of the process that is both quite daunting, but I actually really enjoy.
Oh, really?
Because it's when you show your hand and you're really ready and you're really confident. And I think you enjoy it if you feel very confident and you feel very ready, and you give them a deadline by which to respond. And I think with a feature, it's not as tight as probably a news story that you and Rachel would work on. So it might be a few days because there's a lot for them to digest and check. And then they do come back and respond to everything. And we include all those denials in there. And I think actually they can give a lot of texture to a piece. And you could feel, I was rereading it this morning, and you can feel in some of the denials a sort of sense of scores being settled, and it's sort of actually added to it. So I think one of the one of the allegations about the launch was that there was a huge amount of people who had just come straight from university who were very inexperienced and working with very experienced journalists from Sky and the BBC. And when we put to GB News that they had a very inexperienced launch team, they said that the more experienced journalists had no understanding of the speed and the new digital ways of working, a new sort of thing. So that sort of added a little bit of context and flavour in itself.
Yeah, you can tell the person who was behind writing that response.
Yeah.
Where they lay. It was a great piece. I really enjoyed it. I mean, what do you do when you've got this sort of amazing thing that your reporters uncovered and they have corroborated, i.e. they've heard it from a number of different sources, and then the organisation comes back to you and says that's absolutely not true? I mean, what's your responsibility as an editor?
I think I think if there's anything you're not sure of, if there's anything you think's unfair, if there were some things that we didn't include that we decided was an invasion of privacy, was not in the public interest, was not central to the story. It was very, very interesting, but that didn't justify it. So you include the denial, and I think there were sort of places where they might deny the language used, but didn't deny the story itself. So I think even in the denials, I think with the squash story, that wasn't denied, but the language used and actually where the squash was stored was disputed. But there was enough actually in the denials that made me feel very confident.
Right.
It doesn't remove a small element of risk. So I think, sometimes you think, is it low? Is it high? Is it in the public interest? Do I feel broadly that this is right? And I think actually when we published, we felt enormously vindicated because we heard from so many staff that we hadn't heard from before who were all saying this is unbelievably sort of accurate, and sending us more stuff. And I think someone sent us a picture of Alex Phillips, the presenter who shouted about the squash with her squash. So yeah.
And Rachel, I mean,
such great colour. This squash.
I really feel like squash now. Might start shouting at the producers. Rachel, your process. I mean, you've worked at the Mirror, Huffington Post. Here, you have to do less of the sort of day-to-day sort of very, very fast news turnaround, but still your stories are put together in a completely different way to the features that Melissa works on. In Westminster, you have to rely a lot on anonymous sources. There's a lot of gossip and rumour. How do you navigate that and make sure that it's fair to the people that you're reporting on?
It's really difficult, and it's not something that you're able to do straight away. It takes, you'll make mistakes. For reporters working in politics, I think you're constantly using your judgment, because when you're given things on a source level basis, you're always having to question, like, how does this person benefit? Who are they connected to? What kind of relationship do I have with this person? How much do I trust them? And what does it add, if anything? And then on the other side of that sort of calculation that a reporter's making is kind of, if you have, for example, a tip or a source about an MP's personal life, or is it in the public interest to pursue that line of questioning, because what that MP does in their public life actually has an impact on how well or not they're able to represent their constituents. For example, what that you are being given, does you reporting it add to where the conversation might go in terms of policy? There's so many other things, different things to add up when you're deciding whether to use a source. But in terms of how does building a story on a daily basis work? Well, there are 2 lobby briefings every day where the government will kind of reveal its position on various things that have been reported in the last day or so, or things that are coming up. Reporters be given guidance on the record, and then there's a little section at the end which is known as dark lobby, where reporters are kind of given little nods or positive facial movements on a little bit of guidance where they might sense a direction. But then and then once a week there is a briefing from the opposition party, the Labour Party, at the moment.
So their equivalent process.
Yeah, their equivalent process, which happens just once a week. But you're also constantly in touch with, MPs who have communications officers, and the front bench spokespeople, in terms of putting various different facts and claims to them.
And it's tricky for you, isn't it? Because your job relies on these sources, but you often have to, say things that are uncomfortable for them. So how do you maintain those relationships while making sure that you do your job? It's
difficult. So you have to kind of keep mental hygiene as well, because you'll spend a lot of time with these people. You know what I mean? If you're a politics reporter working in Westminster, you'll often be in the canteen with somebody you're about to write about, and they'll be sat across the table from you, and
you'll be on first name terms sometimes.
You'll be on first name terms, but then you have to write difficult stories about them as well, and challenge them, and that's difficult for them. Sometimes it's difficult for the reporter as well. So I think but it's just something that you have to get used to. And I think what I've learned over time is that a really good politician can take the rough with the smooth. And realise that you're doing their job and they've got their job, and that ultimately your job is to hold them to account and, tell them when their poo stinks sometimes, to sort of use a terrible reference there. But yeah, it's not always easy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose on my part, I'm doing a lot of social affairs reporting, and some of those kind of stories can be quite sensitive because often what's happening to people when they're interacting with government services like social work, which is the story that we might talk about, it's very personal, very intimate, and often, you have to protect the identities of the people involved in those stories. So Melissa, you very expertly guided me through doing a feature about children's social services, which are in a bit of a state at the moment.
Yeah, I'd really urge people to go back and read this piece, which we published just over a year ago. And for which Anoosh won an award. GB News piece won an award as well. So that is one very gratifying bit as editors and writers when that happens. But yeah, this was a very different kind of piece, and I think it started with Anoosh and I talking about a possible long read. She was keen to do something longer term. And the original idea was to find one single social worker that you could really embed with and follow. And we weren't able to do that because the access is sort of so hard. It's such a sensitive job and you're working with children. So what Anoosh did instead was, I think you followed closely two male social workers, and then you had a great range of voices who were either towards the end of their careers or at the beginning, or working with teenagers or small children. But I think I think with both of these pieces, they're very challenging reporting-wise. So a huge amount of the work comes from the writer. And I think it is about gaining trust and time as well. I think, a lot of these pieces I think it took you 6 months, 4 months.
Yeah, and you have to keep going back. And
and I think it's not just that it takes that long to get what you need, it's that you also want to see them, you want to see a sort of narrative arc, and you want to see how things have changed for them. And what maybe we didn't quite anticipate before we went into that story was how tough conditions were for them themselves. That one was using a food bank, had an eviction notice.
Yeah.
They were barely making ends meet themselves, and the mental health pressures. So, it was taking the time to sort of really get to know people and to understand the job and to sort of see them at different points in their working life. I think it's incredibly valuable, and I think it's great that there is still room and space and time within journalism to do that, because the quick stuff is much easier.
I think that's why we wanted to do it, isn't it? Because there were some horrendous stories bunched together. Arthur Libin, Joe Hughes and Star Hobson and other horrendous stories about children having been killed. And we wanted not just to, we didn't want the news agenda just to move on. We wanted to see sort of why did this happen? And so it actually, doing it over 6 months gave us time to look at what in the system led or perhaps was a factor in those tragedies, but also sort of how the system was dealing with it. So I think the reports into those deaths came out while I was reporting the story. And so you could kind of see what happened afterwards rather than their names just being headlines and then the kind of news wagon moves on.
And I think the other thing there's a particular challenge there was because child social workers, more than doctors, more than nurses, are very, very wary of the press because they're only really talked to when there is a tragedy. And then at other times, they're accused of like just wanting to take credit for the good stuff or the good moments. So you found that there was a lot of kind of wariness, that more than you might encounter in other stories.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reporting on the NHS a lot, and it's relatively easy to get doctors and nurses and others to tell you about what the state their hospital is in, for example. But this I found really difficult because they a lot of them have had their sort of fingers burned before by talking to the press, because a lot of the stories about social workers will be stories blaming them for horrendous things that have happened in their services. So they were very wary.
Yeah, and you were able to sort of show systemically, what happens, what goes wrong. And I think in terms of the process, so, Anoosh would do all that heavy lifting and then file me a draft. And then she gets back a sort of stream of irritating questions, which is all why, what, how, tell me what this looks like, can you explain a bit more? So then you have your second draft where she fills in all these gaps, probably in the notes off to the side, so as not to make it sort of too endless. And then I have to work out, what actually I need, and is some of that I just needed to know for background for myself.
Yeah.
And then we work towards a sort of second or a third draft. But yeah.
Yeah, it was great to work on. Thank you for all of your help with it. I hope, Lewis, that's answered your question. And if there's any, pieces that people have particular questions about, then they should write in and ask us, because we do read all your questions, and hopefully we'll have Melissa back at some point. Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.